Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening. I'm back doing another live stream on Twitch slash YouTube slash Facebook. But I might transition, I think I'll transition over to podcasts eventually, but I wanted to do another chunk of this book. So this is a continuation of the collection of little stories, Once on a Time by A. Milne. We are now at chapter 4. The Princess Hyacinth leaves it to the Countess. It is now time to introduce Wiggs to you, and I find myself in a difficulty at once. What was Wiggs's position in the palace? This story is hard to tell, for I have to piece it together from the narratives of others and to supply any gaps in their stories from my knowledge of how the different characters might be expected to act. Perhaps, therefore, it is a good moment in which to introduce to you the authorities upon whom I rely. First and foremost, of course, comes Roger Scrubbylegs. His monumental work, Euralia, Past and Present, in 17 volumes, towers upon my desk as I write. By the merest chance, I picked it up, in a metaphorical sense, at that little shop near... I forget its name. It's the third bookshop on the left as you come into London from the New Barnet end. Upon him I depend for the broad lines of my story, and I have already indicated my opinion of the value of his work. Secondly, come the many legends and ballads handed on to me years ago by my aunt, by marriage, one of the Cornish Smallnoses. She claims to be a direct descendant of that Henry Smallnose whose lucky shot brought about the events which I am to describe. I say she claims to be, and one cannot doubt a lady's word in these matters. Certainly she used to speak about Henry with that mixture of pride and extreme familiarity which comes best from a relation. In all matters not touching Henry, I feel that I can rely upon her. In its main lines, her narrative is strictly confirmed by Scurvylegs, and she brought to it a picturesqueness and an appreciation of the true character of Belvane, which is lacking in the other. But her attitude towards Henry Smallnose was absurd. Indeed, she would have had him the hero of the story. This makes Roger and myself smile. We give him credit for the first shot, and then we drop him. Thirdly, Belvane herself. Women like Belvane never die, and I met her, or a reincarnation of her, at a country house in Shropshire last summer. I forget what she calls herself now, but I recognized her at once, and as I watched her, the centuries rolled away, and she and I were in Euralia, that pleasant country, together. Stayed to tea and was very charming. Would she have said that of me, I wonder? But I'm getting sentimental, Roger's great fault. These, then, are my authorities. I consult them, and I ask myself, what was Wiggs? Roger speaks of her simply as an attendant upon the princess. Now we know that the princess was 17. Wiggs, then, would be about the same age. A lady-in-waiting, perhaps even a little older. Why not, you say? The Lady Wiggs, maid of honour to Her Royal Highness the Princess Hyacinth, 18 and a bit, tall and stately. Since she is to endanger Belvane's plans, let her be something of a match for the wicked woman. Yes, but you would never talk like that if you had heard one of my aunt's stories. Nor if you had seen Belvane would you think that any grown-up woman could be a match for her. Wiggs was a child, I feel it in my bones. In all the legends and ballads handed down to me by my aunt, she appears to me as a little girl, Alice in a fairy story. Roger or no Roger, I must have her as a child. And even Roger cannot keep up the farce that she is a real lady-in-waiting. In one place he tells us that she dusts the throne of the princess. Can you see her ladyship? 18 last February doing that. At other times he allows her to take orders from the countess. I ask you to imagine a maid of honour taking orders from any but her own mistress. Conceive her dignity. A little friend, then, of Hyacinth's, let us say, ready to do anything for anybody who loved, or appeared to love, her mistress. The king had departed for the wars, his magic sword girded to his side, his cloak of darkness, not worn but rolled up behind him, lest the absence of his usual extensive shadow should disturb his horse. He rode at the head of his men to meet the enemy. Hyacinth had seen him off from the palace steps. 5 times he had come back to give her his last instructions, and a 6th time for his sword, but now he was gone, and she was alone on the castle walls with Wiggs. "Saying goodbye to father's is very tiring," said Hyacinth. "I do hope he'll be all right. Wiggs, although we oughtn't to mention it to anybody, and although he's only just gone, we do think it will rather be fun being queen, don't we?" "Well, it must be lovely," said Wiggs, gazing at her with large eyes. "Can you really do whatever you like now?" Hyacinth nodded. "I always did whatever I liked," she said, "but now I really can do it." "Could you cut anybody's head off?" "Easily," said the princess confidently. "I should hate to cut anybody's head off." "Oh, so should I, Wiggs. Let's decide to have no heads off just at present, till we're more used to it." Wiggs still kept her eyes fixed upon the princess. "Which is stronger?" she asked. "You or a fairy?" "I knew you were going to ask something horrid like that," said Hyacinth, pretending to be angry. She looked quickly around to see that nobody was listening, and then whispered in Wiggs's ear, "I am." Oh, said Wiggs. "How lovely, isn't it? Did you ever hear the story of Father and the Fairy? His Majesty? His Majesty the King of Euralia. It happened in the forest one day, just after he became king." "Did you ever hear the story?" "I expect not." "Well, then you must hear it. But there will be too many inverted commas in it if I let Hyacinth tell you, so I should tell you myself. It was just after he became king. He was so proud that he used to go about saying, 'I am the king, I am the king,' and sometimes, 'The king am I, the king I am.' He was saying this one day in the forest when a fairy overheard him. So she appeared in front of him and said, 'I believe you are the king?' 'I am the king,' said Merryweather. 'I am the king, I am the—' 'And yet,' said the fairy, what is a king after all?' 'It is a very powerful thing to be a king,' said Merryweather proudly. 'Supposing I were to turn you into a small sheep, there where would you be?' The king thought anxiously for a moment. 'I should like to be a small sheep,' he said. The fairy waved her wand. 'Then you can be one,' she said, 'until you own that a fairy is much more powerful than a king.' So all at once he was a small sheep. 'Well,' said the fairy. 'Well,' said the king, 'which is more powerful, a king or a fairy?' 'A king,' said Merryweather. 'Besides being more woolly,' he added. There was silence for a little. Merryweather began to eat some grass. 'I don't think much of fairies,' he said with his mouth full. 'I don't think they're very powerful.' The fairy looked at him angrily. 'They can't make you say things you don't want to say,' he explained. The fairy stamped her foot. 'Be a toad,' she said, waving her wand. 'A nasty, horrid, crawling toad.' 'I've always wanted,' began Merryweather, 'to be a toad,' he ended from lower down. 'Well,' said the fairy. 'I don't think much of fairies,' said the king. 'I don't think they're very powerful.' He waited for the fairy to look at him, but she was pretending to be thinking of something else. After waiting for a minute or two, he added, 'They can't make you say things you don't want to say.' The fairy stamped her foot more angrily and moved her wand a 3rd time. 'Be silent,' she commanded, 'and stay silent forever.' There was no sound in the forest. The fairy looked at the blue sky through the green roof above her. She looked through the tall trunks of the trees to the king's castle beyond. Her eyes fell upon the little glade on her left, upon the mossy bank on her right, but she would not look down to the toad at her feet. No, she wouldn't. She wouldn't. And yet... It was too much for her. She could resist no longer. She looked at the nasty, horrid, crawling toad, the dumb toad at her feet that was once a king. And catching her eye, the toad winked. Some winks are more expressive than others. The fairy knew quite well what this one meant. It meant, 'I don't think much of fairies. I don't think they're very powerful. They can't make you say things you don't want to say.' The fairy waved her wand in disgust. 'Oh, be a king again,' she said impatiently, and vanished. And so that is the story of how the king of Euralia met the fairy in the forest. Roger Scurvylegs tells it well, indeed almost as well as I do, but he burdens it with a moral. You must think it out for yourself. I shall not give it to you. Wiggs didn't bother about the moral. Her elbows on her knees, her chin resting on her hand, she gazed at the forest and imagined the scene to herself. How wonderful to be a king like that, she thought. That was a long time ago, explained Hyacinth. Father must have been rather lovely in those days, she added. It was a very bad fairy, said Wiggs. It was a very stupid one. I wouldn't have given in to Father like that. But there are good fairies, aren't there? I met one once. You, child? Where? Well, I don't know if it would have made any difference to Euralian history if Wiggs had been allowed to tell about her fairy. Then, as it was, she didn't tell the story till later on, when Belvane happened to be near. I regret to say that Belvane listened. It was the sort of story that always got overheard, she explained afterward, as if that were an excuse. On this occasion, she was just too early to overhear, but in time to prevent the story being told without her. The Countess Belvane, said an attendant, and her ladyship made a superb entry. Ah, good morning, Countess, said Hyacinth. Good morning, your Royal Highness. Ah, Wiggs, sweet child, she added carelessly, putting out a hand to pat the sweet child's head, but missing it. Wiggs was just telling me a story, said the princess. Sweet child, said Belvane, feeling vaguely for her with the other hand. Could I interrupt the story with a little business, your Royal Highness? At a nod from the princess, Wiggs withdrew. Well, said Hyacinth nervously. Belvane had always a curious effect on the princess when they were alone together. There was something about her large manner which made Hyacinth feel like a schoolgirl who has been behaving badly, alarmed and apologetic. I feel like this myself when I have an interview with my publishers, and Roger Scurvylegs, both upon the same subject, drags in a certain uncle of his before whom, so he says, he always appears at his worst. It is a common experience. Just one or two little schemes to submit to your Majesty, said the Countess. Oh, says Leopold, I mean your Royal Highness. Of course your Royal Highness may not like them at all, but in case your Royal Highness did, I just wrote them out. She unfolded one by one a series of ornamental parchments. They are beautifully written, said the princess. Belvane blushed at the compliment. She had a passion for coloured inks and rulers. In her diary, the day of the week was always underlined in red, the important words in the day's doings being frequently picked out in gold. On taking up the diary, you saw at once that you were in the presence of somebody. The first parchment was headed, Scheme for Economy in Realm. Economy caught the eye in pale pink. The next parchment was headed, Scheme for Safety of Realm. Safety clamored to you in blue. The third parchment was headed, Scheme for Encouragement of Literature in Realm. Encouragement of Literature had got rather cramped in the small quarters available for it. A heading Belvane felt should be in one line, and she had started in letters too big for it, and the fact that the green ink was giving out made it impossible to start afresh. There were 10 parchments altogether. By the end of the third one, the princess was beginning to feel uncomfortable. By the end of the fifth one, she knew it was a mistake, her ever having come into the royal family at all. By the end of the seventh, she decided that if the Countess would forgive her this time, she would never be naughty again. By the end of the ninth one, she was just going to cry, and the 10th one was in a very loud orange and was headed, Scheme for Assisting Calisthenics in Realm. Yes, said the princess faintly, I think it would be a good idea. I thought if your Royal Highness approves, Belvane, we could just... Hyacinth felt herself blushing guiltily. She couldn't think why. I leave it to you, Countess, she murmured. I am sure you know best. It was a remark which she had never made to her father. Chapter 5. Belvane indulges her hobby. In a glade in the forest, the Countess Belvane was sitting, her throne a fallen log, her courtiers that imaginary audience which was always with her. For once in her life she was nervous. She had an anxious morning in front of her. I can tell you the reason at once. Her Royal Highness was going to review Her Royal Highness's army of Amazons. See Scheme 2, Safety of Realm. In half an hour she would be there. She would be here. And why not, you say? Could anything be more gratifying? I will tell you why not. There was no army of Amazons. In order that Her Royal Highness should not know the sad truth, Belvane drew their pay for them. It was better thus. In any trouble, Belvane comforted herself by reading up her diary. She undid the enormous volume and, idly turning the pages, read some of the more delightful extracts to herself. Monday, June 1st, she read, became bad. She gave a sigh of resignation to the necessity of being bad. Roger Scurvy Leagues is of the opinion that she might have sighed a good many years before. According to him, she was born bad. Tuesday, June 2nd, she read on. Realized in the privacy of my heart that I was destined to rule the country. Wednesday, June 3rd. Decided to oust the princess. Thursday, June 4th. Began ousting. What a confession for any woman, even for one who had become bad last Monday. No wonder Belvane's diary was not for everybody. Let us look over her shoulder and read some more of the wicked woman's confessions. Friday, June 5th. Made myself a... Oh, that's quite private. However, we may read this. Thought for the week. Beware lest you tumble down in reaching for another's crown. An admirable sentiment, which Roger Scurvilegs would have approved, although he would not have rhymed it so neatly. The Countess turned on a few more pages and prepared to write up yesterday's events. Tuesday, June 23rd, she said to herself. Now what happened? Acclaimed with enthusiasm outside the palace. How do you spell enthusiasm? She bit the end of her pencil and pondered. She turned back the pages till she came to the place. Yes, she said thoughtfully. It had 3 S's last time, so it's Z's turn. She wrote enthusiasm lightly in pencil. Later on it would be picked out in gold. She closed the diary hastily. Someone was coming. It was Wiggs. Oh, if you please, your ladyship, Her Royal Highness sent me to tell you that she would not be here at 11 o'clock to review her new army. It was the last thing of which Belvane wanted reminding. Ah, Wiggs, dear child, she said, you find me overwhelmed. She gave a tragic sigh. Leader of the Corps de Ballet, she indicated with her toe how this was done. Commander-in-Chief of the Army of Amazons, here she saluted, and it was certainly the least she could do for the money. Warden of the Animacussers and Grand Mistress of the Robes, I have a busy life. Just come and dust this log for Her Royal Highness. All this work wears me out, Wiggs, but it is my duty, and I must do it. Wogg says you make a very good thing out of it, said Wiggs innocently as he began to dust. It must be nice to make very good things out of things. The Countess looked coldly at her. It is one thing to confide to your diary that you're bad, but it's quite another to have Woggses shouting it out all over the country. I don't know what Woggs is, said Belvane sternly, but send it to me at once. As soon as Wiggs was gone, Belvane gave herself up to her passions. She strode up and down the velvety sward, saying to herself, Bother, bother, bother. Her outbreak of violence over, she sat gloomily down on the log. and I assure you, no less exacting. When once has got in, when once one has got into, oh, I just realized I've been muted for a while. Oh well, I'm going to redo these anyways. When once one has got into this habit of flinging or tossing money to give it in any ordinary way, to slide it gently into the palm is unbearable. Which of us who has, in a heroic moment, flung half a crown to a cabman can ever be content afterward to hold out a handful of 3-penny bits and coppers to him? One must always be flinging. So it was with Belvane. The largesse habit had got a hold of her. It is an expensive habit, but her way of doing it was less expensive than most. The people were taxed to pay for the Amazon army. The pay of the Amazon army was flung back at them. Could anything be fair? True, it brought her admiration and applause, but what woman does not like admiration? Is that an offense? If it is something very different from the common theft of which Roger Scurvylegs would accuse her. Let us be fair. Chapter 6. There are no wizards in Barodia. Meanwhile, the king of Euralia was prosecuting the war with utmost vigor. So says Roger in that famous chapter of his, and certainly Merriwig was very busy. On the declaration of war, the Euralian forces, in accordance with custom, had marched into Barodia. However hot ran the passion between them, the two kings always preserved the elementary courtesies of war. The last battle had taken place in Euralian territory. This time, therefore, Barodia was the scene of the conflict. To Barodia, then, King Merriwig had led his army. Suitable pasture land had been allotted them as a camping ground, and amid the cheers of the Barodian populace, the Euralians made their simple preparations for the night. The two armies had now been sitting opposite to each other for some weeks, but neither side had been idle. On the very first morning, Merriwig had put on his cloak of darkness and gone to the enemy's camp to explore the situation. Unfortunately, the same idea had occurred at the same moment to the king of Barodia. He also had a cloak of darkness. Halfway across, to the utmost astonishment of both, the two kings had come violently into contact. Realizing that they had met some unprecedented enchantment, they had hurried home after the recoil to consult their respective chancellors. The chancellors could make nothing of it. They could only advise their majesties to venture another attempt on the following morning. But by a different route, said the chancellors, whereby the magic pillar shall be avoided. So, by the more southerly path, the two kings ventured out next morning. Halfway across, there was another violent collision, and both kings sat down suddenly to think it out. Wonder of wonders, said Merriwig, there's a magic wall stretching between the two armies. He stood up, and holding up his hands, said impressively, Bow ball, Bilbo, bow wall. Mystery of mysteries, cried the king of Barodia. It can... He stopped suddenly. Both kings coughed. They were remembering with some shame their fright of yesterday. Who are you? Asked the king of Barodia. Merriwig saw that there was a need to dissemble. His Majesty's swineherd, he said in what he imagined might be a swineherd's voice. So am I, said the king of Barodia, rather feebly. There was obviously nothing for it, but for them to discuss swine. Merriwig was comfortably ignorant of the subject. The king of Barodia knew rather less than that. How many have you? Asked the latter. 7,000, said Merriwig at random. So have I, said the king of Barodia, still more feebly. Couples, explained Merriwig. Minor ones, said the king of Barodia, determined to be independent at last. Each king was surprised to find how easy it was to talk to an expert on his own subject. The king of Barodia, indeed, began to feel reckless. Well, he said, I must be getting back. It's, milking time. So must I, said Merriwig. By the way, what do you feed yours? The king of Barodia was not quite sure if it was applesauce or not. He decided that perhaps it wasn't. That's a secret, he said darkly. been handed down from generation to generation. Merriwig could think of nothing better to say to this than, "Ah!" He said it very impressively. With a word of farewell, returned to his camp. He was in brilliant form over the wassail bowl that night as he drew a picture of his triumphant dissimulation. It is only fair to say that the King of Barodia was in brilliant form too. For several weeks after this, the battle raged. Sometimes the whole Euralian army would line up outside its camp and call upon the Barodians to fight. At other times, the Barodian army would form fours in full view of the Euralians in the hope of provoking a conflict. At intervals, the two chancellors would look up old spells, and scour the country for wizards, or send each other insulting messages. At the end of a month, it was difficult to say which side had obtained the advantage. A little hill surmounted by a single tree lay halfway between the two camps. Thither one morning came the two kings and the two chancellors, on bloody business bent, the phrase is Roger's. Their object was nothing less than to arrange that personal fight between the two monarchs which was always the feature of Barodo-Euralian warfare. Two kings having shaken hands, their chancellors proceeded to settle the details. "I suppose," said the Chancellor of Barodia, "that your majesties will wish to fight with swords?" "Certainly," said the King of Barodia promptly, so promptly that Merriwig felt certain that he had a magic sword too. "Cloaks of darkness are not allowed, of course," said the Chancellor of Euralia. "Why, have you got one?" said each king quickly to the other. Merriwig was the first to recover himself. "I have one, naturally," he said. "It's a curious thing that the only one of my subjects who has one is my swineherd." "That's funny," said the King of Barodia. "My swineherd has one too." "Of course," said Merriwig. "They're almost a necessity in swineherding. Particularly in the milking season," said the King of Barodia. They looked at each other with added respect. Not many kings in those days had the technicalities of such a humble trade at their fingers' ends. The Chancellor of Barodia has been referring to the precedents. "It was after the famous conflict between the two grandfathers of your majesties that the use of the magic cloak in personal combats was discontinued." "Great-grandfathers," the Chancellor of Euralia. "Grandfathers, I think. Great-grandfathers, if I'm not mistaken." Their tempers were rising rapidly, and the Chancellor of Barodia was just about to give the Chancellor of Euralia a push when Merriwig intervened. "But never mind about that," he said impatiently. "Tell us what happened when our ancestors fought." "It happened in this way, your majesty. Your majesty's grandfather—" "Great-grandfather," said a small voice. The Chancellor cast one bitter look at his opponent and went on. "The ancestors of your two majesties arranged to settle the war of that period by personal combat. The two armies were drawn up in full array. In front of them, the two monarchs shook hands. Drawing their swords and casting their magic cloaks around them, they—" "Well?" said Merriwig eagerly. "It's rather a painful story, your majesty." "Go on, I shan't mind. Well, your majesty, drawing their swords and casting their magic cloaks around them, they returned to the wassail bowl." "Oh, dear, dear," said Merriwig. "When the respective armies, who had been waiting eagerly the whole of the afternoon for some result of the combat, they returned to camp, and they found their majesties asleep," said the Chancellor of Euralia hastily. "Asleep," agreed the Chancellor of Barodia. The excuse of their two majesties that they had suddenly forgotten the day, though naturally accepted at the time, was deemed inadequate by later historians, by Roger and myself anyway. Some further details were discussed, and then the conference closed. The great fight was fixed for the following morning. The day broke fine. At an early hour, Merivale was up and practicing thrusts upon a suspended pillow. At intervals we consult a little book entitled Sword Play for Sovereigns, and then return to his pillow. At breakfast he was nervous, but talkative. After breakfast he wrote a tender letter to Hyacinth, and a still more tender one to the Countess Belvane, and burnt them. He repeated his little rhyme, "Bowl, bowl, bill, bowl," several times to himself until he was word perfect. It was just possible that it might be useful. His last thoughts as he rode on to the field were of his great-grandfather. Without admiring him, he quite saw his point. The fight was a brilliant one. First, Merriwig aimed a blow at the King of Barodia's head, which the latter parried. Then the King of Barodia aimed a blow at his adversary's head, which Merriwig parried. This went on 3 or 4 times, and then Merriwig put into practice a remarkable trick which his captain of his bodyguard had taught him. It was his turn to parry, but as doing this, he struck again at his opponent's head, and if the latter in sheer surprise had not stumbled and fallen, there might have been a very serious ending to the affair. Noon found them still at it, cut and parry. At each stroke, the opposing armies roared their applause. When darkness put an end to the conflict, honors were evenly divided. It was a stiff but proud king of Euralia who received the congratulations of his subjects that night, so proud that he had to pour out his heart to somebody. He wrote to his daughter, "My dear Hyacinth, you will be glad to hear that your father is going on well, and that Euralia is as determined as ever to uphold its honor and dignity. Today I fought the King of Barodia, and considering that, most unfairly, he was using a magic sword, I think I may say that I did well. The Countess Belvane will be interested to hear that I made 4,638 strokes at my opponent, and parried 4,637 strokes from him. This is good for a man of my age. Do you remember that magic ointment my aunt used to give me? Have we any of it left? I played a very clever trick the other day by pretending to be a swineherd. I talked to a real one I met for quite a long time about swine without his suspecting me. The Countess might be interested to hear this. It would have been very awkward for me if I had been found out who I was. I hope you're getting along all right. Do you consult the Countess Belvane at all? I think she would be able to advise you in any difficulties. A young girl needs a guiding hand, and I think the Countess would be able to advise you in any difficulties. Do you consult her at all? I'm afraid this is going to be a long war. There doesn't seem to be a wizard in the country at all, and without one it's a little difficult to know how to go on. I say my spell every now and then. You remember the one? Bilbo, Bilbo, Wol, Will, Wol. And it certainly keeps off dragons, but we don't seem to be getting any nearer to defeating the enemy's army. You might tell the Countess that about my spell, and she would be interested. Tomorrow I go on with my fight with the King of Barodia. I feel quite confident now that I can hold him. He parries well, but his cutting is not very good. I'm glad the Countess found my sword for me. Tell her that it has been most useful. I must close now, as I must go to bed so that to be ready for my fight tomorrow. Goodbye, dear. As always, your loving father. P.S. I hope you are not finding your position too difficult. If you are in any difficulties, you should consult the Countess Belvane. I think she would be able to advise you. Don't forget about that ointment. Perhaps the Countess might know about some other kind. It's for stiffness. I'm afraid this is going to be a long war." The king sealed up the letter and dispatched it by special messenger the next morning. It came to Hyacinth at a critical moment. We shall see in the next chapter what effect it had on her. But we're not going to read the next chapter right now. That's the end of this story for today. We'll continue on another day with Chapter 7. The princess receives a letter and writes one. So, take care, my friends. Stay safe, stay happy, stay away from each other. Ta-ta for now.